Welcome everyone. Thank you for staying with us. You're watching Plain Speak. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Let's take you through the top 6 developments coming in at 6 p.m. US President Donald Trump has issued a fresh warning to Iran. He says the United States is totally destroying Iran, both militarily and economically. The US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth has rejected CNN's report of a Trump administration underestimating Iran's war impact on the Strait of Hormuz. He's vowed no mercy on the enemy. Iran continues to target Gulf nations. Dubai skylines cut again. A financial center comes under a drone strike in Dubai, while drone strikes on US assets have inflicted heavy damage and fire in the UAE. Iran has launched its 44th missile and drone wave under Operation True Promise 4, targeting Israel cities and US military bases across the region. India's External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar has dialed the Iranian Foreign Minister for the 4th time since the war began, while the Iranian Foreign Minister has cited need for BRICS to play a constructive role in supporting security in the region. External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar has emphasized the importance of strengthening sustainable stability in the region as a collective need. Indian vessel Shivalik has left the Strait of Hormuz. It's carrying over 40,000 metric tons of LPG. Government sources say another ship is expected in 6 hours following successful negotiations. The conflict in West Asia is set to complete a fortnight. From global economy disruptions to attacks spreading to the sea, this conflict continues to reverberate across the Middle East and the stock markets across the globe, raising the moot question: has the Trump administration underestimated Iran's war's impact on the Strait of Hormuz? According to government sources accessed by CNN, the Pentagon and National Security Council significantly underestimated Iran's willingness to close the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that claim has, of course, been dismissed by US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, but this was in response to US military strikes while planning the ongoing operation, is what CNN sources are saying. Of course, they also say that key officials, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Energy Secretary Chris Wright from the Departments of Energy and Treasury, were present for some of the official planning meetings about the operation before it began. But the agency analysis and forecasts that would have been integral elements of the decision-making progress or process in the past administrations has been significantly reduced. They have now become secondary considerations for the Trump administration. And now it may be weeks before the administration's efforts to alleviate the intensifying economic fallout takes hold. That includes high-risk naval escorts of oil tankers through the strait that the Pentagon believes are currently too dangerous to conduct. Now, the president, meanwhile, has continued to downplay the tumult in energy markets. This as 16 vessels have been destroyed by Iran in just 13 days. Has US lost its battle of perception in this fortnight's time? That's a question we'll be probing in just a bit. But let's also break down for you what the CNN report actually goes on to cite. It's got some interesting observations over here. This CNN report raises serious questions about the US assessment of Iran's strategy when it comes to the conflict. According to the report, US National Security Council misread Iran's response. This was the biggest strategic error. According to this report, there was a significant intelligence gap in Washington's planning. The US National Security Council is also said to have misread how Iran would in fact respond to these military strikes. The report also goes on to indicate that a key worst-case scenario may have been overlooked, which was the Strait of Hormuz. This is an unprecedented scenario, remember, because US officials reportedly believe that closing the Strait of Hormuz would hurt Iran more than it would hurt the United States or even its allies. It also points to concerns that broader economic fallout, particularly the impact on global energy markets, was not fully factored into the war planning. Another issue highlighted in this report is the limited interagency input, whether it is the Treasury Department or say even the military, the Defense Department. There seems to have been no coordination. President Trump is said to have relied on a tight circle of advisors during the critical decision-making process. All of the report says may have created a strategic blind spot, with the Trump administration underestimating Iran's willingness to escalate pressure through the Strait of Hormuz, and that it has very much done. Now, US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth has rejected CNN's report, calling it fake. Listen in to what he had to say.
Or more fake news from CNN. Reports that the Trump administration underestimated the Iran war's impact on the Strait of Hormuz. Patently ridiculous, of course. For decades, Iran has threatened shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. This is always what they do, hold the strait hostage. CNN doesn't think we thought of that. It's a fundamentally unserious report. The sooner David Ellison takes over that network, the better.
Let's also tell you how Iran actually outmaneuvered US and what exactly led to this strategic miscalculation on the part of the United States. Because Iran is primarily using costly munitions like the Tomahawk missiles as far as the United States is concerned, but Iranians are using cheaper drones to respond to the US missile attacks. Next, the low-flying one-way attack drones are evading traditional air defenses, striking oil facilities, even their military bases and high-rises across the Gulf. That includes posh residential localities as well. Missile launches have slowed drone attacks, which are continuing at a steady pace, showing Tehran's tactical shift. The Strait of Hormuz, of course, remains a pressure point, with the US yet to start escorting tankers, adding to the regional security strain. Iran is reportedly capable of producing thousands of drones and intelligence sharing with Russia, boosting their operations so far. The message is clear. Tehran has turned the cost and numbers into a strategic advantage, challenging conventional US military power. And so, with tensions high in the Gulf, the question on the table is, what are President Trump's possible exit options in Iran? Or has he bitten more than he could chew? Option one is that he could declare victory, citing the elimination of top Iranian leaders. That includes the previous Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The second option over here for the US president is that he negotiates a coercive settlement or a limited deal with Iran, something that perhaps even Iran has hinted at. The third option over here is that he pursues a full de-escalation, potentially offering concessions to Tehran. Is Tehran even looking for those concessions, given that Ayatollah, the newly appointed Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has already indicated that they will seek revenge and there is no releasing of the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. The fourth option being he sends a special force to secure or destroy Iran's nuclear material. Remember, that is not possible without any ground incursion. The fifth option is that the armed rebel militias are backed by the United States with the aim of bringing down the regime. And the sixth option, a very interesting one, he allows the regime to continue provided its leadership is acceptable to US interests, something he's already managed in Venezuela. And so, as far as the ongoing Gulf War is concerned, the big question we are posing to our guest today is, has US lost the battle of perception? That's a question we'll be probing. And let's take that question forward with Troy Blackwell, who's a former Deputy Chief Communication Officer during the Kamala Harris regime, during, in fact, Biden administration as well. Many thanks to you, Troy. We meet again. Thank you for joining in on CNN News 18. How do you assess the overall trajectory now that this war is all set to enter a fortnight's time? Day 14 is what we are looking at. Do you think the battle of perception has not fallen in Washington's favor so far?
Good morning, and thanks for having me. Yes, we have lost the battle of perception around this war. I will start off by saying that this war, one, is illegal and unconstitutional by the United States standards. So the attack on Iran happened without the United States congressional approval. So this is something that President Trump solely made the decision on his end up front, and so Congress was left out of the decision-making process. And by our Constitution, Congress has to be involved and give full approval, which they have not done. And second, we have lost already military men and women in this fight. And many of our people, at least on the American front, do not even understand why we are in this war, whether we are calling it a war. There's been footage of the president saying that this is a war, then it's an escalation, then it's not. He's kind of joked about the situation. So I do think that there's general confusion. And when we look at what's happening, I know you mentioned earlier about whether the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, had all the information at hand. There are federal offices across the United States government, whether that's the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the National Security Council. There are offices that have career staffers who have worked under Democrats and Republicans, some for years, many for decades, who would do risk analysis and would provide this information.
Okay. So
when
help me understand, when you're talking about confusion, even the Biden administration is accused of a chaotic pullout from Afghanistan. How do governments avoid this confusion? This CNN report, which has been dismissed, say, by Pete Hegseth, in fact, accuses the Trump administration, especially its National Security Council, of not being able, or rather overestimating the US capacity and underestimating Iran.
Yes, I think they're completely underestimating Iran because they've gutted the offices that do the risk analysis work. So regardless if you have a Democrat or Republican administration, we do have federal offices that look and do risk analysis on the situation before the United States intervenes in any country. Those offices at the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, the National Security Council, when President Trump came in a year ago, he gutted those offices. He closed those offices down. He fired about 90% of the government staff that work in those offices that even provide the analysis to his cabinet. So the people who would normally do this risk analysis, that would look and provide the information, whether it's about one, how we make sure that we are not harming civilians at war, or two, the cost analysis, even just the general strategy of this. None of those folks are there. 90% of those folks no longer have their jobs or work for the US government. So I think that's really the downfall that we're starting to this. And the other thing that I will say is that there's a little bit of an arrogance, from my opinion, on the Trump administration, because I think they got comfortable with the invasion of Venezuela and thought because they were successful in Venezuela that they would be successful in invading Iran. And they're seeing now that these are two very different strategies and two very different governments. So regime change in Venezuela is not going to be the same as regime change in Iran.
True. But Troy Blackwell, also take me through the developments within United States. It seems like Donald Trump is fighting multiple wars, one in West Asia, and there's one within the US Congress, not just with the Democrats, who in fact heavily differ, but within his own MAGA base. Many of these Republicans are actually condemning him for embarking on this war.
Yes, many are, and most notably Congresswoman or former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. You have a lot of Republican news anchors who are kind of going against this. I think the confusion is that President Trump, when he was a candidate, ran on no new wars, no regime change. Now that he's in office, this seems to be the focus, that these foreign wars are taking precedent over domestic policy, and he and his administration are not even explaining why. So when it comes to the situation of Iran, he has not publicly explained why there's any intervention happening, what we are fighting for, what we are hoping to get out of this, what is the goal. So there's a confusion on the American public front about what is even happening. And then when we get these daily news alerts, it's a little bit of over deliver information for the American public. So everyone is looking for answers, basically saying, if we are going to a war, you're invading a country, you're sending our sons and daughters in uniform to fight overseas, explain to us why this is happening and what is the goal. And we have not seen that. And what we have seen is that we've seen the president, we've seen the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, and others jokingly and cavalierly make jokes about the war when in fact we are losing people. And just the other day there was a missile attack that hit a all girls school that killed I believe 175 girls, and we knew that based on the information that attack happened by a Tomahawk missile, which the only people using Tomahawk missiles is the United States government, and President Trump joked it off cavalierly. So that's kind of where the confusion is on the
Troy,
American
help me understand, who holds your US president responsible? Very glad that you spoke about this human rights violation, a blatant disregard for international norms. Apart from that attack on the girls' school in Minab, we've seen how they attacked an Iranian ship which was involved in a friendly naval exercise in India, which means it was defenseless. At the time, it was torpedoed, and we only had the defense secretary and the US president tom-tomming about it, making jokes about it. So who holds the US president responsible? What is the US Congress doing about it?
The U.S. Congress is fighting to hold him accountable. I think Democrats are fighting tooth and nail to hold him accountable, but right now we are outnumbered. So it's going to require a lot more Republicans to hold him accountable. And right now we're not seeing that. Even though we're seeing dissenting voices, a lot of the dissenting voices are those who are no longer in public office. Those that are still in office are afraid to criticize President Trump. And the prime example being Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. The minute she differed and gave a different opinion than President Trump, he publicly went against her, and those in the MAGA base started to make death threats against her and her son, and she essentially feared for her life and ultimately resigned from Congress. So she's no longer in Congress, even though she was just there maybe less than 60 days ago. So that's what's really happening in the United States Congress, is that Democrats are looking and hoping to find Republicans that will be able to hold him accountable. Because what he's doing is he's taking unconstitutional action without congressional approval and basically going to Congress after the fact, and Republicans are just voting along and going with whatever he says. So there's no checks and balances here on the Republican side.
In a year which is so critical for him and for the Republicans, given the midterm elections, what could this mean for Donald Trump's popularity ratings, which were already hitting an all-time low even before the war began? Critics have already highlighted that this could well be a diversionary tactic. Also to perhaps camouflage attention from Epstein files. But do you think this diversionary tactic has now backfired?
Absolutely. It's absolutely backfired. I think the Epstein files are still top of mind. Every news show, channel, commentary, the Epstein files, there's consistently new information every week. So there's no way that President Trump and his administration can run away from their attachment to Jeffrey Epstein. But also, again, the American public did not want any new wars. They were not asking for regime change. So I think even for everyday Republicans, those who live in middle America, and particularly in conservative states, I think they are concerned and questioning. So this could backfire on Republicans in our midterm elections this year.
Absolutely. It would be interesting to see how the rednecks who've supported the US president, how they respond to this war as well. Because remember, it was the morality belt that ensured his victory. Whether the morality belt is going to choose against this US president is going to be the big question now. Many thanks to you, Tom Blackwell, for joining in. Pleasure as always to interact with you on the show.
Thank you.
The other big angle that we are going to be probing on Plain Speak is also to discuss the overall war narrative that is now taking a darker turn. What began as a conflict over oil routes, even strategic dominance, now risks becoming a war over water. From Beirut to Minab, civilian infrastructure is also increasing in the line of fire. The reported strikes near a desalination facility have raised serious concerns about the safety of critical lifelines in the Gulf. Why so? Because remember, it is through these desalination plants that 85 to 90% of water supply comes for the Gulf region. In a region where millions depend on these plants for drinking water, any attack or damage to such plants could trigger a humanitarian crisis. So the big questions that are critical civilian facilities becoming collateral damage. And if such strikes are confirmed, who will be even held accountable? Is Donald Trump going to be accused of war crimes? But let's take you through some of the important visuals. On 28th of February, when the conflict actually broke out, there was a deadly strike on an Iranian school. This was a school that in fact hit the Shajara Tayyibeh Girls' School in the city of Minab. This is in southern Iran. Over 150 girl students died in this blast. It brought down parts of the two-story building during school hours, trapping students and teachers inside. Initial reports have in fact indicated that more than 170 people, most of them girls, have been killed and several others injured. Let's take you through more visuals. A school turned into a graveyard. What was once a place of learning has now become a symbol of unimaginable tragedy. These are the visuals of the graves. In the Iranian city of Minab, the Shajara Tayyibeh Girls' School was reduced to a rubble after the devastating strike that took place, that too during class hours. These are the heartbreaking visuals of all of those graves that were dug for nearly 170 students in southern Iran, where thousands gathered for a mass funeral following the devastation on this girls' elementary school. A school that echoed with the voices of children now falls silent, turning into a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost of this war. There are also growing concerns about attacks and near misses involving critical desalination facilities that I was talking about across the Gulf. The infrastructure that millions depend for drinking water. On 9th of March was the first strike that took place as reports emerged of possible damage at the Fujairah F1 power and water complex in UAE. However, later assessments suggested there was no confirmed damage to the desalination infrastructure. But look at the intent, because on 7th of March, Iran's foreign minister reportedly, in fact, mentioned a strike on a desalination plant in Qashm Island. The impact, according to Iranians, disrupted water supply to nearly 30 villages. A day later, on 8th of March, Bahrain reported a drone strike near one of its desalination plants. Now, Bahrain claims it was a strike conducted by Iran. Authorities say there was no disruption to water supplies. Going back to 2nd of March, debris from an intercepted projectile struck Kuwait's Doha West Power and Water Desalination Complex. It sparked a fire in a fuel tank at the facility. On 2nd of March, again, Iranian strikes near Dubai's Jebel Ali port landed close to one of the world's largest desalination plants. The officials say the facility itself was not affected. So remember, it's not just a war about oil and gas, one that's also had its own set of environmental impact and damages, as it's been raining soot in Iran. On the other hand, you also have the attack on the desalination plants. Let's weigh in on what it's costing humanity at the moment. And for that, I'm joined in by a very special guest, Ravina Shamdasani, who's the spokesperson of the UN Human Rights, joins me live from Geneva. Thank you, Ravina, for joining in. Let's start with the crimes against humanity that have been taking place in this overall conflict in West Asia. What is the UN's assessment of the violation of international norms that's taking place? There was a makeshift camp in Lebanon that was attacked. The attack on girls' school in Minab, over 150 girl students were killed. What's the UN's assessment of this kind of blatant human rights violations that are taking place?
Akanksha, the situation is just going from bad to worse. The initial attacks themselves, the attacks by the United States and Israel into Iran, were inconsistent with international law. The attack on the girls' school, which we understand is still being investigated, was absolutely horrific, and it may raise serious questions on international humanitarian law as well. As you said, more than 160 girls were killed in the middle of their school day, blood-stained backpacks, and just a horrific situation. And it's really become a symbol of the senselessness and the cruelty of this war. Since then, we've seen Iran attacking many other countries, Gulf countries in the region. We've also seen Hezbollah attack Israel and Israel's pummeling of Lebanon, including areas that are protected under international law, schools, medical centers, camps for displaced people, mass evacuation orders that have been issued, displacing most of the population of Lebanon. This is completely unacceptable.
It's also become a war over fresh water. In fact, look at the strikes that have taken place at the desalination plants. The voice coming in from Iran is that it is the United States which set the precedent by attacking the desalination plant first. Is this not a dangerous precedent, given that 85 to 90% of the freshwater supply of the Persian Gulf comes from these desalination plants? What is your assessment of such strikes escalating further?
So the strikes on the desalination plants are an example of strikes on essential civilian infrastructure. Now, this is clearly prohibited under international law. People say things like this happen during times of war, but what we need to be clear about is that even wars have laws. The laws of war are called international humanitarian law. And under international humanitarian law, it is strictly forbidden to attack critical civilian infrastructure. And that's what we've been seeing. We're also seeing attacks on oil facilities, which have led to toxic fumes in the air over Iran. It's even led to toxic rainfall in Iran, causing serious health issues. And if you think about how this is impacting the most vulnerable, newborn babies, elderly people, people with disabilities, pregnant women. I mean, there is no military advantage that can be gained from these kinds of attacks. It is simply cruel and a violation of international law.
Since you talk about violation of international law, what is the UN's point of view when it comes to violation of international law, which we've seen happen in the Indian Ocean region, where a defenseless Iranian ship was torpedoed? Remember, it was returning from a friendly military naval exercise in India, and yet it was targeted. Remember, they were defenseless. What's the UN assessment?
So again, this is again an example of how this conflict has not just been confined to the Middle East region or the West Asia region, but rather is reverberating around the globe. And this is exactly what happens as well when there is impunity for violations of international law. People often think this is something that's happening in Ukraine or it's happening in Gaza and it's far from home. This is not going to affect me. But when there are violations of international law that go unpunished and unaddressed, it spreads, it reverberates around the world. And this is exactly what we've seen with regards to the attacks on naval vessels in different seas. International law, again, is clear that people who are not taking active part in hostilities and even armed group members who are not fighting, who have, for example, been hit and are overboard on a naval vessel, they have international protection. They should be rescued. There are rules around this. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that the rules are not being followed.
We're glad we're having this conversation because the UN Security Council has backed a resolution calling for Iran to stop its strikes on Arab Gulf states and Jordan. But many critics have in fact highlighted how there was no mention of US-Israel bombardment of Iran, and it has also condemned the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. How do you speak to those who are saying that the UN Security Council has been left paralyzed?
There's such a double standard, and this is not doing justice to the issues that we are facing today. The UN Security Council was correct in calling for an end to attacks by Iran into the Gulf countries, in highlighting the impact of the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, but in not calling out as well the violations of international law by the United States and Israel. I'm afraid they have not done justice to the issue. They have only exposed the double standards that are out there around this conflict.
We've seen that there's the creation of a board of peace in Gaza, one that many have said is undermining the UN authority. Do you see that global superpowers like the United States are now bypassing time-tested multilateral institutions like the United Nations?
The United Nations is not perfect, but it is essential for maintenance of international peace and security, to provide a forum for member states to talk so that you don't have the all-out conflict that we have seen in the past. The creation of other bodies, if the aim is to promote peace, of course we would welcome that. But the creation of bodies that seek to replace the United Nations and that seek to almost make it a commodity to have a seat on the table, that does not contribute to efforts towards international peace and security. What we are calling on all heads of state to do is to recommit to the United Nations, to recommit to multilateralism and to the defense of international law. Because as I said, even if there are countries that are not currently directly affected by this conflict, the blatant disregard for international law in one part of the world will eventually have a serious impact on all of us.
Thank you, Ravina, for keeping it an honest and frank conversation. It was a pleasure speaking to you as always. All right, and that's all I have for you in this edition